The air shimmered like a mirage over the scorched Libyan landscape on that August morning in 1942. Hauptmann Friedrich Müller wiped the sweat from his brow, squinting through binoculars from his camouflaged position in the rocky outcrop. His reconnaissance unit had been tracking unusual Allied supply movements for days, but what they discovered in the small oasis town ahead defied all intelligence briefings. The markings on the trucks were unmistakable. The red star of the Soviet Union blazed defiantly under the North African sun, 1,500 miles from the Eastern Front, where such vehicles belonged. The very existence of Soviet equipment this deep in the Mediterranean theater was an impossibility that changed everything. As Müller scribbled furious notes in his field journal, he couldn't possibly know that he had stumbled upon one of the war's most closely guarded secrets, the hidden supply chain that linked America's arsenal of democracy with Stalin's desperate armies through the back door of the Middle East. The date was August 14, 1942. Operation Torch was still months away. The Battle of Stalingrad hung in the balance, and Rommel's Afrika Korps remained a lethal threat despite their defeat at El Alamein weeks earlier. The discovery of Soviet supply trucks in Libya was not merely a military curiosity, but a strategic revelation. While German intelligence knew of American Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union, through the treacherous Arctic convoys to Murmansk and the distant Pacific route to Vladivostok, they had drastically underestimated the scale and ingenuity of a third supply route, one that ran through Persia and occasionally branched into the Mediterranean theater itself. The men of Müller's reconnaissance unit watched in disbelief as crates of ammunition, spare parts and medical supplies, all bearing American manufacturing stamps, were loaded onto the Soviet vehicles by a multinational crew of British, American and Russian personnel. The Persian corridor had become the unsung lifeline of the Allied war effort, a supply route that connected 3 continents and allowed Western aid to reach the desperate Soviet armies. While the northern route to Murmansk and Archangel struggled under German air and submarine attacks, and the Pacific route required Soviet-flagged ships to avoid Japanese interference, this third route through Iran had become increasingly vital. After the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran in August 1941, which deposed the pro-German Shah, the Trans-Iranian Railway had been transformed into a critical artery pumping Western supplies northward. What Müller had discovered was an emergency diversion, special shipments being rerouted through North Africa due to a temporary blockage in the Persian route, a desperate improvisation born of war's necessity. The morning heat intensified as Müller's unit observed the convoy. The vehicles were American-built Studebaker US-6 trucks, part of the almost 430,000 trucks sent to the USSR during the war, but bearing Soviet markings and modifications. The drivers were a mix of nationalities, their uniforms showing the strain of long desert journeys. From their vantage point, the Germans could hear snatches of Russian, English, and even Persian being shouted across the dusty depot. The supplies themselves told a complex story. American canned rations, British radio equipment, and spare parts for tanks and aircraft that would soon be killing German soldiers a continent away. This wasn't merely a supply chain, it was the physical embodiment of the Grand Alliance that threatened to crush the Third Reich between its eastern and western jaws. Feldwebel Werner Schiller shifted uncomfortably beside Müller, his weathered face etched with concern. "It's worse than we thought, Herr Hauptmann," he whispered, passing a canteen of tepid water. "Those aren't just any trucks. Look at the modifications." Müller focused his binoculars again and realized Schiller was right. These weren't ordinary supply vehicles. They had been specially adapted for the harsh desert conditions, with extra filtration systems, reinforced suspensions, and additional fuel tanks. They've been planning this route for months, Müller realized. This isn't an emergency measure, it's a deliberate strategy. The implication hit him like a physical blow. The Allies had created redundancies in their supply network that German intelligence had completely missed. The Soviet presence in North Africa had been a carefully guarded secret, hidden beneath layers of operational security and misdirection. While Stalin had publicly pressured Churchill and Roosevelt for a second front in Europe to relieve pressure on the Red Army, behind the scenes a more complex relationship had developed. Operation Torch, the Anglo-American invasion of French North Africa, in November 1942, was partly a response to Stalin's demands, diverting German resources from the Eastern Front. But months before Torch, smaller cooperative efforts were already underway. Soviet advisors with desert warfare experience from their pre-war conflicts had been quietly attached to British units, and specialized equipment was being exchanged between the Allies. The heat became oppressive as noon approached, the rocky outcrop offering little shade. Muller's reconnaissance unit remained frozen in place, documenting everything they observed while staying hidden from the Allied sentries, patrolling the perimeter of the supply depot. Through his binoculars, Muller could see the meticulous organization of the operation. This wasn't an ad hoc arrangement, but a well-orchestrated logistical ballet. The Americans provided the materials, the British secured the routes, and the Soviets contributed drivers and mechanics familiar with operating in harsh conditions. It was a glimpse into the growing coordination between the Allies that would eventually overwhelm the Axis powers on multiple fronts. As a decorated veteran of the Polish and French campaigns, Muller felt a chill despite the desert heat. He had witnessed the Wehrmacht at its most triumphant, but this discovery suggested that the tide of war was shifting in ways that Berlin had not anticipated. The most striking aspect of the supply depot was not just the presence of Soviet personnel, but the sheer volume of materiel being processed. Thousands of tons of supplies were being directed through this single outpost, suggesting a scale of Allied cooperation that dwarfed German intelligence estimates. Muller observed American jeeps, British radio equipment and Soviet field kitchens all operating side by side. There were crates marked with Cyrillic lettering being loaded onto British trucks, and American mechanics working on Soviet vehicle engines. This wasn't merely a case of occasional aid or symbolic cooperation. It was a fully integrated multinational operation. Most concerning were the large crates being handled with particular care, which Muller suspected contained advanced technical equipment or weapons systems. As the afternoon wore on, Muller's unit observed another unexpected development. A group of men in civilian clothes arrived at the depot, their manner suggesting authority despite their informal appearance. Through his binoculars, Muller could see them examining documentation and consulting with the military personnel. "Intelligence officers," Schiller whispered, his experience from counter-espionage training evident. British SOE, perhaps, or American OSS. The presence of Allied intelligence services at the supply depot suggested that this wasn't merely a logistical operation, but also an information exchange, another layer of cooperation that German intelligence had failed to detect. The reality of the situation became increasingly clear. The Allies weren't fighting separate campaigns, loosely coordinated by diplomatic agreements. They were developing an integrated approach to global warfare that shared not only materiel, but also intelligence, expertise, and strategic planning. As dusk approached, Muller made the difficult decision to withdraw before his unit was discovered. The information they had gathered was too valuable to risk capture. Moving with practiced stealth, the reconnaissance team retreated through the gathering shadows, carrying with them documentation that would force a significant reassessment of German strategy. The desert night closed around them, stars emerging in a clear sky that stretched from Europe to Africa to Asia, the same sky under which Allied convoys were now moving with increasing confidence, connecting factories in Detroit to battlefields in Stalingrad, through paths that German planners had failed to anticipate or disrupt. The journey back to German lines was arduous, the desert unforgiving even at night. Muller's thoughts raced as he calculated the strategic implications of what they had witnessed. The Soviet presence in North Africa was not merely surprising, it was a fundamental challenge to German military doctrine, which had always treated the Eastern and Mediterranean fronts as separate theaters requiring different approaches. If the Allies had succeeded in creating functional links between these theaters, then German forces were facing not distinct enemies, but a truly united coalition with the ability to shift resources between fronts as needed. Most concerning was the realization that the Allies appeared to be solving the logistical challenges that many German officers had believed would limit their effectiveness. The Libyan stars offered cold comfort as Muller led his men through the barren landscape. The distant rumble of artillery fire marked the front lines where Rommel's forces still battled Montgomery's 8th Army. Muller wondered if the field marshal knew about the Soviet presence in his theater of operations. Rommel had been begging Berlin for additional fuel and supplies for months, insisting that with proper support, he could drive the British from Egypt and secure the Middle East oil fields. Yet Hitler had consistently prioritized the Eastern Front, sending the bulk of German resources to the battle against the Soviet Union. Now Muller understood a crucial piece of the strategic puzzle. The North African campaign wasn't merely a sideshow, but an integral part of the Allies' global strategy, linking their war efforts across continents in ways that German planning had failed to anticipate. 2 days later, Muller delivered his report to General Major Hans Kramer at Africa Corps headquarters. The room fell silent as officers absorbed the implications. "If this information is accurate," Kramer finally said, It explains much about recent Soviet resilience on the Eastern Front. The intelligence was immediately transmitted to Berlin, where it created significant concern among the OKW staff. Hitler himself was briefed on the discovery, reportedly flying into a rage at what he considered another failure of German intelligence. The information contributed to his growing conviction that the Mediterranean theater required greater attention, leading to the decision to send additional air units to Sicily and North Africa, aircraft that would be sorely missed during the critical battles on the Eastern Front in late 1942. The meeting with Kramer stretched into the night as officers debated the appropriate response. Some advocated immediate airstrikes against the identified supply depot, while others argued for a more comprehensive approach targeting the entire Allied supply network in the region. Logistics officers presented sobering assessments of Allied capabilities based on the new information, revising upward their estimates of how quickly the Soviets could replace losses on the Eastern Front. "Gentlemen," Kramer concluded, "we are no longer fighting separate enemies, but a single foe with resources spanning continents. We must adapt accordingly." The true scale of Allied cooperation, revealed by Müller's discovery, went far beyond what most German officers had imagined possible. The notion that American trucks could roll off production lines in Detroit, cross the Atlantic, traverse North Africa, and ultimately deliver supplies to Soviet troops fighting in Russia represented a level of logistical sophistication that challenged fundamental assumptions about modern warfare. The traditional advantages of interior lines that had served Germany well in previous campaigns were being negated by the Allies' ability to move resources globally with increasing efficiency. The war was evolving from a series of connected regional conflicts into a truly integrated global struggle, and the German military, for all its tactical brilliance and fighting spirit, was struggling to adapt to this new reality. A week after Müller's report, Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights confirmed the existence of additional supply depots along the route he had identified. German intelligence analysts pieced together a more comprehensive picture of the Allied supply network, tracing shipments from American factories through the Mediterranean and into the Soviet Union. The findings were disturbing. Not only was the volume of material far greater than previously estimated, but the sophistication of the distribution system suggested years of planning and coordination. The Allies weren't merely sending occasional shipments of surplus equipment. They had created a systematic approach to global logistics that effectively linked their war efforts across theaters. The implications were profound. Germany wasn't fighting distinct enemies on separate fronts, but a single integrated coalition that could shift resources between theaters as strategic priorities dictated. The Mediterranean air became even hotter as August dragged on, the sun relentless in its punishment of men and machines alike. Müller found himself assigned to a special intelligence task force charged with tracking Allied supply movements. His discovery had earned him recognition from the highest levels of the Wehrmacht, but with it came a heavy responsibility. As he pored over maps and reports in a sweltering command tent, connecting the dots between shipping manifests and frontline equipment deployments, the full strategic picture became increasingly clear. The war had evolved beyond anything envisioned in pre-conflict German planning. The Reich's early victories had relied on rapid, decisive campaigns against isolated opponents. Now Germany faced a fundamentally different challenge, a war of attrition against a global coalition with seemingly limitless resources and increasingly sophisticated methods for deploying them. The intelligence task force's findings painted a sobering picture. The Soviet supply trains in Libya weren't an isolated anomaly, but part of a vast, interconnected system spanning 3 continents. American industrial production, which Hitler had famously dismissed before the war, was now reaching full capacity, churning out mountains of war materiel that flowed to all Allied fronts. British naval power secured the sea lanes, while a growing network of air bases provided coverage for vulnerable convoy routes. Most surprising was the level of standardization being achieved across the Allied forces. Ammunition calibers, vehicle parts, radio frequencies, and fuel specifications were increasingly compatible, allowing resources to be redirected between American, British, and Soviet units as operational needs dictated. The Germans, by contrast, were still struggling with incompatible equipment standards even between their own army and air force. In early September, Müller accompanied a Luftwaffe bombing mission targeting one of the identified supply depots. The attack achieved tactical surprise, destroying several warehouses and dozens of vehicles. Yet as Müller observed from a reconnaissance aircraft the following day, the damage was already being repaired, with new supplies flowing in to replace what had been lost. The Allied logistics network had built-in redundancies and remarkable resilience. Knock out one node, and traffic simply rerouted through others. The German military, accustomed to seeking decisive battlefield victories, was unprepared for this kind of distributed struggle, where success couldn't be measured in territory gained or enemy formations destroyed. The war had become a contest of systems rather than armies, and the Allied system was proving remarkably robust. By October 1942, the strategic picture in North Africa had shifted dramatically. Montgomery's Eighth Army had defeated Rommel's forces at El Alamein, beginning a push westward that would eventually drive the Axis powers from the continent. Plans for Operation Torch, the Anglo-American landings in Morocco and Algeria, were in their final stages, and the intelligence provided by Müller's discovery had catalyzed a fundamental reassessment of German strategy. Resources that might have been sent to the critical battle at Stalingrad were instead diverted to the Mediterranean in a belated attempt to secure supply lines and counter the Allied logistics network. The decision would have far-reaching consequences, contributing to the catastrophic German defeat on the Eastern Front that winter. The winds of war shifted across the Mediterranean as winter approached. In November, American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria, squeezing Axis forces in North Africa between two advancing Allied armies. The Soviet supply depot that Müller had discovered months earlier was now deep behind Allied lines, its existence no longer a secret but a symbol of the coalition's growing strength. The trucks that had so shocked the German reconnaissance unit were now a common sight across the theater, part of the massive buildup of Allied forces that would eventually drive Axis powers not just from Africa, but from southern Europe as well. The war had reached a turning point, not through a single decisive battle, but through the relentless pressure of a global logistical system that the Germans had neither fully understood nor effectively countered. In December 1942, as Stalingrad was encircled and the fate of the German Sixth Army sealed, Müller found himself transferred to the Eastern Front. The irony wasn't lost on him, as he observed Soviet T-34 tanks with components manufactured in America, or Red Army troops wearing boots produced in British factories. The supply routes he had helped identify in North Africa were now functioning at full capacity, channeling a torrent of Allied resources to the front lines. The German army that had once seemed invincible was increasingly outmatched not just in numbers, but in equipment quality and availability. Tanks broke down for lack of spare parts, while Soviet formations constantly replenished their losses with fresh men and machines. The war had become one of industrial capacity and logistical efficiency, precisely the kind of conflict that Germany, for all its tactical brilliance, was ill-equipped to win. The story of the Soviet supply trains in North Africa remained classified for decades after the war, known only to a handful of intelligence officers on both sides. The full extent of Allied cooperation in the Mediterranean theater emerged only gradually through historical research and the declassification of wartime records. What these documents revealed was not merely a tale of supply chains and material transfer, but a more profound narrative about how the Allies learned to overcome national differences and institutional rivalries to forge an effective coalition against the Axis powers. The Soviet trucks in the Libyan desert represented more than just military hardware. They symbolized a new approach to global conflict that would shape warfare for generations to come. In Moscow, London, and Washington, the lessons of these combined operations informed post-war military planning and alliance structures. The networks established during the desperate days of 1942 created templates for international cooperation that would evolve into NATO, the Warsaw Pact, and other Cold War alliances. When American planners designed the Berlin airlift in 1948, they drew directly on experience gained supplying the Soviet Union through challenging routes during the war. The legacy of these operations extended beyond military affairs, influencing approaches to international aid, disaster response, and global logistics. The Soviet supply trains that appeared impossibly in North Africa had demonstrated that the traditional constraints of geography could be overcome through multinational cooperation and innovative thinking. Today, as you stand in the silent desert where those supply depots once bustled with activity, little remains to mark these historical events. The wind has erased the tracks of the Soviet trucks, and the oasis settlements have returned to their timeless rhythms. Yet the strategic principles demonstrated in those desperate wartime innovations continue to influence global affairs. Modern military planners still study the Allied supply operations of World War II as models of effective coalition logistics. The discovery that so shocked Hauptmann Müller and his reconnaissance unit represents more than just an historical curiosity. It marks a pivotal moment when warfare transcended traditional boundaries and became truly global in nature. The story of the Soviet supply trains in North Africa reminds us that history often turns on unexpected connections and hidden relationships. The great battles that dominate our historical narratives depend on the less visible struggles to move men and materiel across vast distances. If you find yourself drawn to these hidden dimensions of warfare, consider exploring the tangled supply lines that sustain modern conflicts, or investigating how today's military alliances build on the lessons learned during those desperate days when Soviet trucks rolled improbably through the desert sands. Our understanding of the past continues to evolve as new documents emerge and fresh perspectives develop. Like Hauptmann Müller on that fateful August morning, we might yet discover connections that transform our understanding of how history unfolded across the forgotten sands of war.